Okay, apparently I'm live here. So I'm live from Dominican Republic. I'm on the porch. You can see, let me get my little camera out there. These are the mountain ranges in the background. That one's about, let me see, turn it straight there, Kennedy. Yep, there's our mountains in the background. Let's see if I can get some color in there. All right, so this is where I'm at. I'm in Dominican Republic, right here doing a little research. But this is really dark. So what I'm going to do is see if I can turn around where it won't be so dark. Oh, that's much better. You can see the reflection in the window. Okay, so at any rate, normally we would have class today, and in class we would be talking about an introduction to ecology, or maybe we'd have done that on Monday, but that's all right. I wasn't planning on actually having class on Monday anyways, but it turns out to have internet regardless. So for those of you following at home, if you've got access to the PowerPoint, I unfortunately um, my Logitech doesn't want to communicate with YouTube right now, so I can't split my screen, unfortunately. But I'll see if I can get that figured out by tomorrow. But at any rate, on this introduction to ecology, ecology is what I'm trained in as a scientist, and it's one of my favorite subjects in the world. They're all my favorite subjects, right? I know I'm going to lose some credibility here. But ecology is really about those day-to-day interactions. How do plants and animals interact with each other? How do they interact with their environment? And the connection with the ecology and evolution is that those day-to-day those day-to-day interactions of surviving, eating, reproducing. Guess what? That actually drives evolution in the long run. If you're surviving because you're fit to the environment, guess what? Um, you're more likely to survive if you can avoid disease, avoid a predator, find some food, find a mate, right? So it's these day-to-day interactions that over the long term actually drive evolution. Now, as we do ecology throughout the semester, there is different levels of ecology that we're going to discuss. And ecology is, I mean, it's really broad in scope. So it begins all the way down at the level of the organism or physiological ecology. And in fact, our own Blair Wolf in the UNM Bio Department, he does a really excellent course on biophysiology or ecophysiology, and he studies how different organisms, how the different species are adapted to environments. So for example, some of the work he's done is the level of the organism is understanding heat tolerance and desert adapted animals. So think about that. If you're adapted to a desert, you can probably handle some heat and some and low water. So there's all of these adaptations that desert animals have to like conserve water, avoid the heat. And what he's really interested in is okay, is if we have a warming environment, how are they going to respond to that warming environment? So he's been on the forefront of showing that like a heat wave, okay, if you can survive 120 degrees or 115 degrees, but you die at 117, if we get a heat wave at 117 degrees, you die even if you have shade and water. So we can actually map out what's going to happen, the distribution of animals based on their thermal tolerances, based on future models of climate change. And man, they've been very successful doing that. So that's an example of physiological ecology, is studying how an individual organism is adapted to their environment. And Chris Witt, he also does that as well. He studies, these small little hummingbirds way high in the Andes Mountains. I mean, think about this, you're 13, 14,000 feet. I'm sucking wind at 13, 14,000 feet, right? But these little hummingbirds, they're flying around with no problem. And there's some adaptations they have at the physiological level. Like, not only do they have these one-way lungs, which are very efficient, but their hemoglobin is a little bit different. It holds on to oxygen a little bit differently than ours does. So once again, examples of physiological ecology. All right, I got the proper field drink right here. Yes, that is a monster. I am birding. Oh yeah, hold on one second. Got bird book. And I do have my camera right here ready to go in case I see something. All right. So who knows if we're gonna see something or not. Okay, so yeah, flies are in here. It's kind of awful, but that's okay. Um, at the next level of ecology, from physiology, as you can imagine, if you're studying the physiology of individuals and how they're adapted, the next level up is population ecology. And population ecology, now we're going to study what affects population dynamics. So things of population dynamics are how big is your population, right? What's your rate of individuals leaving that population? That's immigration, or coming to immigration, right? Immigration, very, very similar. One has an I, one has an E. One's coming to you, one's going away. Immigration and immigration, what's affecting these population sizes over time. And there's also birth rate, death rate. Are your individuals, what's the rate of how many of them are going to make it to breeding age? How many of them when do they reach breeding age? And so there's all kinds of ways of studying population ecology. And we've discovered that, different organisms often have different types of survivorship curves and things like that. So you could imagine there's some things called an oyster, and oysters will just release thousands, hundreds of thousands of eggs. Hardly any survive, right? Or I've seen frogs lay hundreds of eggs. And a frog might live longer than you think, a few years. In fact, some salamanders can live like 20 years. But these frogs will lay like a massive, hundreds of eggs. Almost none of them survive, right? So they have a very high rate of mortality early on. But then once they reach adulthood, then they're more likely to survive for a much longer time. And then you've got like a squirrel. Every year that a squirrel is an adult, they have about the same probability of surviving to the next year. It's about 20%. So squirrels typically don't live much beyond about 5 or 6, 7 years because they drop off at about 20% each year. And then you have a human, and humans, we have very low mortality throughout much of our life. And I mean, historically, we're 50% would make it to about age of 5, which is pretty good for most animals. Now we've got that way, way, way down. But with humans, we have a very different survivorship curve where most of us make it to adulthood. Most of us actually make it to most of our lives. And then it's at about, around 70 to 90. That's when, most people die. So, we have a very different survivorship curve compared to like a frog or a squirrel or, and then there's us. So these are some of the issues that people deal with population ecology. What are those factors that allow a population to grow or maintain its size, or will cause it to contract? So birth rate, death rate, immigration, and then all these other factors. It's called life history factors. When is the age of first reproduction? How many years are you going to reproduce? How many babies might you produce in a year? What's the survivorship of all of these? And those life tables are actually really important for understanding things like conservation, because if you understand like where the bottleneck is, where these animals are really likely to get nailed, then you can work on that. So a great example of population ecology and life tables is the green sea turtle, or sea turtles in general. You've probably seen that sea turtles come up on beaches to nest, and they lay hundreds of eggs, well, 40 to 50, and but every year these females will, they'll sometimes swim hundreds, thousands of miles back to the same beach where she was born, and she'll lay these eggs. Well, a lot of people really focused on making sure those little baby turtles made it back out to the ocean, right? Now, ironically, is for a long time we really had no idea where those baby turtles went. Now, if you've been listening to the news, there's this giant, massive sargassum out in the ocean, and everybody's, like, oh my gosh, this is going to hit Florida. It's going to have all this seaweed. It's going to be horrible. And all I can think of, man, there's a lot of primary productivity out there in the ocean where there wasn't some, and there might be a lot of habitat for little baby fish and little baby sea turtles. But I digress here. The issue with the baby sea turtles is that's where a lot of the focus was. Well, it turns out that they already have a high mortality anyways. What they needed to find and save were the juvenile sea turtles, and those are the ones that were getting caught in fishing nets, specifically shrimp nets. And that that population or that age class was what needed to be conserved the most. So circa 1980s, they put these things called turtle exclusion devices on these shrimp nets. And so that way the sea turtles could swim out of it. And that turned out to be really important for the recovery of these sea turtles. And then today, of course, the beaches where they nest is becoming quite important as well. So yeah, that's an example of where, like, in population ecology, constructing those life tables is really important. Okay, so if you go from studying ecology at the level of the individual, like how are they adapted to the environment? What are their physiological tolerances? To now we've got this these populations and how populations change over time. And now we're going to move on to community ecology. Now, community ecology is, I really enjoy community ecology because community ecology is studying like how individuals interact with each other. It's all of the biotic interactions, not just individuals of the same species, but all the individuals of different species. How are they interacting? So it's really focusing on the biota, plants, animals, fungus. And, for a long time, our early ecological studies really showed that predation, competition was very important for driving, these communities in terms of how they're structured and, just community structure, like how many individuals do we see of each species, how are they interacting? And in the last few decades, we've really discovered that it's not just predation that's important. It's very important, but cooperation. And we're seeing more and more of these, mutualistic, cooperative interactions. And a good example of that are like pollinators. Think of like bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, of which I saw the vervain hummingbird, second smallest bird in the world, by the way. I was very excited about that. Got some photos. I'll show them in class when I get back. But yeah, so that's a positive interaction, right? And when you think about it, the diversity we see today of hundreds of thousands of plant species, well, 300,000, 280,000 of those are flowering species that make flowers and fruits to attract pollinators. And when we look at the diversification of insects in the Cretaceous till now, much of that has been caused or driven by flowering plants. So we have 1 million species of insects, right? We can thank flowering plants for that. So those are positive interactions. And some of these positive interactions, cooperation, a plant that is being munched on by a grasshopper, by an herbivore, right, will have a response inside that plant to like protect itself, to produce all of these chemicals that make it taste bad. And they'll start producing them pretty rapidly to prevent this grasshopper or other herbivore from eating it. Well, they can release those chemicals into the atmosphere, and other plants unrelated to them can pick it up and start producing chemical defenses against herbivory. Plants are talking to each other, through the air, through chemicals. How amazing is that? Here's another good one for you. Here's another great one of cooperation. There's in fungus, in forest, I jumped the gun a little bit there. In forest, check this out. You get a lot of roots underneath the ground. Well, that makes sense, right? And you get these roots underneath the ground, and they have these mutualistic fungus that are associated with these roots. And we don't really know how many species of these mutualistic fungi there are. They're called ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal fungus. Whether or not, it doesn't matter if they go into the roots or not. Don't worry about that. You'll learn that in plant and animal form and function. But these fungus help plants acquire nutrients in the ground. We knew that. We knew that was a plus symbiotic relationship. Now check this out. It turns out that these fungus have these hyphae, these root-like structures. They're tiny. You can't really see them going throughout the whole forest, right? And they're connecting, and they're talking to each other, and they're sending chemical signals. So when you walk through a forest, underground, in the ground, those roots, those trees and bushes and shrubs are talking to each other, sending chemical signals, even sending and partitioning out resources, nutrients. So there's no competition. It's like much more cooperation than we ever thought. But it was always thought that, plants are always working to shade each other out and who can get to the sun. And that's part of it. That's there, but that's not the whole story. And to me, these things are very important, very interesting. And if you're a parasitologist, there's all these, plus minus relationships where parasites will get in and change the behavior of the host and make them like get eaten so they can pass the parasite on to the next host. So there's like all kinds of things that are happening at the community level. Those are just some ideas of cooperation. I mean, we're going to go into much more detail this summer about, well, in the next few weeks anyways, about some of these community interactions, because to me, those stories and understanding how people discovered those stories is very important. And when it comes to community ecology, here's one really good one that I'll leave you on to show like how you can have direct and indirect interactions and how one species can have a ripple effect through an entire ecosystem. And I'll talk about this more. I think I have a podcast on it. But the introduction of a lake trout can affect elk populations. How about that one for you? By introducing lake trout, you can affect elk populations. This has been really well established in Yellowstone. And yeah, it has to do with the way that they breed and how they don't migrate up into the rivers. The lake trout don't like the regular cutthroat trout do. The bears, as a result, don't go in there to catch those trout because they're not there so much anymore because they displaced a native cutthroat trout. And as a result, there's like without the bears going in there, yeah, you can start to see we start having other things are being affected, and it's just rippling through the entire ecosystem until it affects like who's foraging around there. So yeah, I'll finish that story later because it's a good one. I'm going to leave you hanging a little bit on that one. It's in a science paper if you want to look up lake trout and elk and bear. All right, next one. So we got ecology, at the physiological level. We've got population level ecology. We've got community ecology. When you take the next step up, we have ecosystems ecology. And ecosystems ecology, now we're going to take all those biotic interactions, and now we're going to have how those biotic interactions, how life interacts not only with each other, but with the environment. And in ecosystems ecology, to me, is also really interesting because now we're going to start seeing like carbon cycles, water cycles, phosphorus, and other nutrient cycles. How does carbon move back and forth between an organic reservoir, which would be in life, like in a plant or an animal, to inorganic reservoirs, which could be carbon dioxide, fossil fuels. It could be in rocks. So carbon is constantly moving back and forth between these different reservoirs. And interestingly, one of the very important things that I'm very interested in with ecosystems ecology is not just the nutrients and the water cycles, but also the energy flows. And to me, the energy flows interact with nutrient availability is incredibly important for patterns of diversity. And if you think about it, like where I'm at right now I've realized that Dominican Republic, Hispaniola is Dominican Republic. Hey, it's not really that much of an island. There's 6,000-foot mountains right here. This is a continental fragment. And as a result, it's got mountains, it's got valleys, it's got this, very complex habitat, and it's incredibly diverse. And it's old, but it's also got a lot of energy and nutrient availability. So it's really a diverse island. I think we've collected 15 species of anoles, and that's a pretty good amount of anoles for what we've done so far. We've only herped a couple of different places. But in ecosystems ecology, like it's energy flows that make those nutrients available. And the flip side is you can have deserts with lots of energy, but if you don't have the resources, like something as simple as iron, some of the most like biggest biological deserts in the world are like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I know, in the water with plenty of sunlight. And the issue is you just don't have the nutrients required for life. They're out there. They're just not very much. So there's very little life. most of us, when we think of deserts, we think of like the Sahara Desert, just sand dunes, right? Or like the planet Dune. And yeah, not a lot of life out there. There's just plenty of energy, but there's no water. Okay, so that's an example of ecosystems ecology. So when we get to that subject, we're going to talk about these nutrient energy flows, and I'm going to really kind of tie those two together to explain like the patterns of diversity, like why the tundra is much less diverse than the tropics, and that's looking at complexity of ecosystems, which is I would define that as like the amount of diversity and the number of interactions you have. That would be an idea of complexity is increased with your energy flows and your nutrients. Okay, so here we go. We got physiological ecology, we've got population ecology, we've got community ecology, and then we also have ecosystems ecology. Now, our book doesn't really have something called landscape ecology. Interestingly, that's kind of what I did for my PhD. But landscape ecology looks at these ecosystems. Now, ecosystems are it's a loose term for what we call these interacting components. And ecosystems can be very large, it can be very small. It's kind of user defined. But basically, where you have two very different ecosystems come together. Think about like the Chihuahuan Desert, which is kind of where we live in Albuquerque, and the Rio Grande, right? That's an aquatic environment, and specifically, it's a lotic environment, as it's got moving water. But where that desert and the water meet, we have a forest made of cottonwoods we call the bosque or the bosque, and that is a prime example of an ecotone. And if you notice, or maybe you haven't, but there's a lot more diversity in that ecotone, and the reason why it's a mixture of where these two ecosystems are coming together. So ecotones where you might get like a beach or a shorefront or where a forest meets a grassland. These ecotones are very important for diversity. There's a lot of unique animals. Like you go to the Rio Grande, right along the shoreline, there is a lot of insect predators that you will not find anywhere but on their shorelines. So that's landscape ecology, studying where ecosystems come together. And then, of course, one thing that's very important that like landscape ecology shows you, just because you have a lake, just because you have a river, just because you have terrestrial versus aquatic ecosystems, a beach versus the ocean, they're not separate. All these ecosystems are intricately connected to each other through nutrient and energy flows, right? And that nutrient and energy flows, move between these aquatic and terrestrial or between ecosystems, and that's part of what's driving that diversity there. So all these ecosystems are interconnected. So as you go up in scale, you can imagine that you can get to what is called global ecology, and that is understanding these large scale patterns across the globe. And that's where we introduce things like the biomes. And biomes might have completely different species from one continent to the next, but they operate very similarly. So like a simple one is a desert. You're going to have very different species, even in our own Southwest, between Sonora, Chihuahua, and the Mojave Desert. 3 different deserts right there, 3 different biota right next to each other here in the Southwest. And you go to the Great Simpson Desert of Australia, operates really similarly. Low patterns of diversity. They're adapted to these harsh, dry environments. There's all this, physiological adaptations. They convert, a lot of animals and plants converge on it. So in Africa, you don't really have cactus like we do. They have something called a euphorbia. Think poinsettia, the one with the big bright red bracts. Those euphorbs in Africa have become, they look like cactus for us. Convergent evolution, they're solving similar problems. You could go to a rainforest, whether that's the Amazon or the Congo or Malaysia. Almost completely different species throughout those whole basins. Hold on one second, get filled up here. So in global ecology, it's how all these different biomes interacting with each other. And we're really learning that, global ecology really does matter. So for example, right now we're going into El Nino, and man, El Nino for us and out in the Southwest, we might get a little bit wetter of a monsoon, but this El Nino, it's a warm water. So imagine South America, and as you go westward, Imagine warm water moving across the Pacific, and that change in in that area there completely affects like the rainfall we get in the Southwest. And if you've noticed, there's some wildfires up there in Canada. Yes, these things are connected. Australia has been wet; they're going to probably go into a drought. Okay, so that is global ecology. So that's our introduction to ecology. I'm going to keep it relatively short here. If anybody has any questions, you can hit me up on the chat there. I hope the stream came through. I haven't gotten any notices saying that it wasn't working out, but so I hope you enjoyed it. I'll do another. I think I can do another lecture tomorrow. And what I'm going to do is introduce the biomes. All right. Well, let's stay tuned. I think I'll see you again tomorrow, and we'll do biomes, and I will definitely see you next week. All right, y'all have a good one.